Previously on Climbing Gold.
There was this ideal that somehow you were pursuing something that was more personally valuable to your life than anything the traditional world offered.
Everybody was too much of a misfit, and none of us fit in.
Camp 4 was the center for climbing.
Climbing offered this opportunity to test yourself against the world.
So you're saying that the Stone Masters, they smoked too much weed and they slab climbed at a high level?
Yeah, more or less.
It's a big plane. It's got a 76-foot wingspan. It's flying at well over 300 miles an hour. So they're flying this thing at roughly 50 to 60 feet. The left wing dropped a little, and that's what caught the trees.
The plane can't stay in the air. It ends up crashing into Lower Merced Pass Lake, generally affectionately referred to it as Dope Lake.
Yeah, okay, I'm starting to piece it together.
Holy shit. There's an airplane, and it's full of marijuana. Next question.
This is part 2 of Dope Lake,
A 4-part series on one of climbing's most unbelievable true stories.
Sometimes life is stranger than fiction. I'm Alex Honnold.
I'm Fitz Cahall.
And I'm Lauren Delaney Miller.
This is Climbing Gold. Chapter 2, Yosemite Mafia. Well, let's just start at the beginning. I mean, how did you first hear about the plane crash?
Well, plane crashed on December 9th, 1976, but we didn't know about it for another 47 days.
This is Ranger Butch Farabee.
Some cross-country skiers, I think employees of the Ahwahnee Hotel, in fact, were out cross-country skiing, and there wasn't that much snow that winter. It was a fairly dry winter, at least at this point. And they stumbled across the wing of this aircraft. They came in and reported it. The search and rescue officer at that time was Tim Setnicka.
I was working on a Sunday afternoon in January, and I got a call from a patrol ranger who asked me if we still had a map of the plane crashes in Yosemite. At that time, there was no GPS, GIS, there was no satellites, et cetera, et cetera. Back in the Pleistocene back then, what we had was just a standard Yosemite map with X's on it. And throughout Yosemite's history, there had been various plane crashes, and they all were, located and all cleaned up. But occasionally people would run across, some pieces of metal and think, oh, it's a plane crash. So we just kept track in case someone reported that in.
So Tim takes the report from the skiers and he goes to check the map, assuming that the wing is from a crash that he already knows about. But the location where the hikers reported finding the wing isn't anywhere near the X's that he already has marked on the map. The skiers had written down the wing number, and so Tim starts calling around, but no one seems to know anything about this crash. But then a half an hour or so in, his phone rings, and it's the feds.
Tim starts to get the sense that something weird is going on. They're asking for his credentials. He's like, what is happening? But no one will tell him anything, and he keeps getting called by higher ups. And before he knows it, there's a helicopter inbound to Yosemite Valley to ferry rangers to the site of the crash.
They flew 3 rangers in, and initially all they could find was the large wing that was propped up among the trees. But eventually, within an hour or so, they were able to follow the breadcrumbs over to the lake, where the plane is now underneath roughly 12 to 16 inches worth of ice, plus some snow on top of it.
As soon as they get there, they see all these dimples in the snow. And as they approach the lake, the rangers can see why Customs is so interested in this plane. The blocks sticking up out of the ice are frozen bales of weed, and there are a lot of them. Do you know much about the Stoneman Meadow riot?
I don't know anything about the Stoneman Meadow riot. I don't even know where Stoneman Meadow is, which is weird because I spent a lot of time in Yosemite. I'm like, where's Stoneman Meadow? Is that the one across from Church Bowl?
It's actually the one across from Curry Village.
Young kids didn't want to camp in the campground with the families. They wanted to be off on their own, be able to enjoy their music, each other, smoke dope, whatever they wanted to do, but they didn't want to do it in the confines of a campground where you had to be in a site with 6 people, and that was the family unit.
This is Ranger Mark Forbes.
And that was the Park Service idea, and that's what the Park Service was trying to maintain, was this order in the campground of these family units.
There are people who are hurt.
And the youth at the time didn't fit into that program.
There are clubs and sticks.
So the Park Service made a decision to try to clear this meadow, and they used force, which did not work out.
By a horse completely. Knocked down. It's now a whole thing.
Fortunately, no one was killed, but there were shots fired, there were vehicles burned, and it was a full-blown riot.
Mace is burning in my eyes, burning in everybody's eyes. Get this action, man. They're wrecking people.
Frankly, it just looks like hell to see a ranger who's got a certain tradition.
The riot lasted for 2 days. Butch, Mark, Tim, none of them were rangers in Yosemite in 1970. But the Stoneman Meadow riot would deeply impact the trajectory of their professional lives. The riot made national news and became a black eye for the Park Service, and the Nixon administration made a change to NPS leadership.
They just said, we're going to try a whole new management approach and bring in a whole new group of people to manage Yosemite, and just kind of wipe the slate clean and start all over again.
So the director at the time decided to completely change the culture of the park and the management. And he came in a very rare circumstance, removed a large number of permanent as well as seasonal employees by various means. And he handpicked the superintendent and their successors who weren't in the traditional manner of coming up through the ranks. Most of them, if not all of them, were not forestry majors, were not natural resource management majors. They had different skill sets. And so that's how that sort of culture was implemented, was sort of in one big swoop.
So the new management decides that the Rangers, they're going to need more training. The Federal Law Enforcement Training Center opens in 1971, and by the 1970s, they're sending the Rangers to D.C. to get trained. So there's a group of 30 to 40 young Rangers in Yosemite who excel at this task. 1970s Yosemite was certainly the place to be if you were a climber. But the same was true if you were a park ranger.
So we kind of grew up together those 5 or 6 years while we were in Yosemite, doing different things, helping the law enforcement program in the park at least grow, and became a fairly tight group of people. But it was just that core group of people, and some people resented it. Oh, you got a job because you were part of the Mafia.
The Yosemite Mafia. This cohort of Rangers would go on to have incredible careers in the Park Service. In the winter of 1977, though, they were young, cutting their teeth, and possessed a range of skills they were ready to use. But when the helicopter from Lemoore Air Force Base set them down at Lower Merced Pass Lake, the scene in front of them would require the full suite of skills they were developing.
So the Rangers look around, and there's a plane sticking up out of the ice, and there's bales of marijuana floating to the surface, and the next day, Customs shows up.
We'll be back with more after the break.
This blue has U.S. Customs emblazoned on the side and a big shield. Helicopter lands in Cap Meadow, and these 2 agents get out. And as I said, they had these blue jumpsuits with, U.S. Customs patches on there, their last names, and shoulder holsters with these pistols in there. They looked like they were right out of Central Casting.
Over the next few days, the Rangers and the customs agents, taking advantage of good weather, teamed up to try to remove the pot out of the backcountry.
Where these bales of marijuana, these 80-pound bales, would float up, and they were covered with ice, and we had chainsaws. We'd cut those, try to cut those bales up. And for 3 days, we had just bluebird weather in February, just nice blue sky days, crisp, got us out of the valley and to do something a little different. And we got to do a little diving.
When the Rangers get all the weed that they can from near the surface, they decide they need to go deeper.
Visibility was about 2 or 3 feet. You're in this 33-degree water. We didn't have really the right equipment.
We were using a 3/8-inch neoprene wetsuit that we'd fill in February, so we'd fill that full of hot water before we got in, and we'd drink a lot of coffee so we could recirculate the warm water in the suit.
You know, I've been diving since 1958 or so, and it's by far the worst diving I've ever done.
The water was not very clear because you have hydraulic fluids, gasoline. The plane is there, and it's all jagged pieces of aluminum. You've got some wiring, those kinds of things. So it's kind of a scary dive. In one way, it was fun and it was exciting, but the other was just really scary just to be in that situation, and you were going to go under the ice, a foot of ice. So it wasn't a normal dive for us.
They can't find the bodies of the pilots. So they decide to call this guy from Fresno who owns a dive shop in the hopes that better gear will solve this problem.
The gentleman from Fresno had communications equipment, so he could go down and do a little more in-depth searching around, but it was such shallow water that really couldn't do much. We couldn't find the pilots at that time. We had information that there might be a logbook of some sort, there might be money, there might be hard drugs that we were looking for, that if we could get those out of the water, that would help DEA more than the Park Service. And then our job was to recover as much of the marijuana out of the lake as we could. And as we pulled out the marijuana, we'd put it on the old Huey helicopter that the Customs and DEA had, and they'd fly it back in the valley.
There's a full-fledged U.S. Bureau of Prisons jail in Yosemite Valley. So the marijuana started getting stored in one of these cells. So directly below this particular cell was the fire management officer's desk. And this stuff was so wet and so yucky, the stuff that we got, that it leaked through the floor and down onto this guy's desk down below. He'd been in the Korean War. He was a Korean War military policeman and sort of a huff and gruff kind of a guy. Take no prisoners kind of a mentality. And this thoroughly irritated him that all this stuff is dripping onto his desk. So at that point, during my era, we had an incinerator in the park. So they ended up taking all this dope with the exception of like one bag, which they kept for evidence in case something were to be prosecuted. So they ended up disposing of it that way.
Surprisingly enough, when you start flying helicopter loads of marijuana back in the park, you can't be very discreet as much as you want to be. And people sort of figured out what we were doing. So it wasn't really a well-guarded secret.
Word starts to get out amongst the wintering climbers. And no one's really sure how the word got out. Some say it was employees at the Ahwahnee Hotel, and some say it was friends that worked for the Curry Company. It might even have been Rangers. I mean, it's not like anyone was really trying to be that discreet about it. But after a few clear days of flying these bales of pot from the lake back to the valley, the weather comes in and the conditions at the lake are totally heinous anyway. Like it's freezing cold, the diving conditions are terrible, and the Park Service decides that they can just put everything on hold until the spring. Like the pot is 13 miles in the backcountry, it's guarded by this icy lake, and they think, surely this can just wait until spring.
Well, what we didn't really fully appreciate was the entrepreneurial nature of the local climbers.
So you can kind of imagine that there's Camp 4, and there's all these different climbers from all over the place staying there. And then in the back corner is the search and rescue site. And that's where there are these canvas-walled tent cabins, basically, that the Park Service provides in exchange for people volunteering their time to do rescues.
The search and rescue site in Yosemite has a definite Lost Boys vibe. It feels like Peter Pan. It's like with high lines and zip lines and tarps and, wood piles and throwing axe targets. Like who knows what, all kinds of weird things. I mean, it definitely has a Lost Boys vibe.
Yeah, so when you're on SAR, you don't really do anything other than climb and go on SARs. And so it's like being fit is like your full-time job.
The climbers in Camp 4 were uniquely well positioned to reap the bounty of the plane crash. Basically, people living in Camp 4 had the fitness, the disposition, the time available. Like, they were already good at navigating the backcountry. They knew the trails. They were willing to trudge in the snow.
And like, yes, of course you want to be fit so that you can go on rescues and help people more quickly and more efficiently. But I feel like really the most important part is that you want to be able to go on SARS and then not be so worked that you can't go climbing afterwards.
And I think most importantly, they had the motivation for it because they had no money. Basically, they were incredibly well adapted to toil. And it's really hard to hike that far into the backcountry in the snow and then carve blocks of weed out of ice. But if your whole life is toiling anyway, and you're incredibly fit and you have no money, you're like, what else do you have to do? You may as well just head back in there and do this. And so I think by contrast, when the Rangers are bringing helicopters in to pull out the wreckage and remove the weed by helicopter, you can see that, none of them are making money off this in the same way. They don't have quite the same incentives. They're like, what's the easiest way to do this? As opposed to the climbers who just want to get it done, are willing to take great personal risk to benefit from this incredible opportunity that just befell them.
Everyone at the time would have heard this helicopter going back and forth and their ears would have perked up, because that's even true today. Like, we use helicopters for fires and we use helicopters for big rescue missions. And those are the two ways that Starsiders make the most money. And so when you're in the valley and you hear the like wop, 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 wop of a helicopter coming in, your ears totally perk up and you're like, oh, someone's about to make some money.
Here's climber Rick Akamazo again.
When I got there and I saw these people who never had money before now had money, it was like it fell from heaven. It literally fell from heaven. The riches fell from heaven. And that's an amazing story. It really is.
So it really did feel like the gold rush or something. Like, it felt like this incredible life opportunity to strike it rich in the mountains.
Exactly.
They basically post-holed and hiked up to the lake.
Here's Dale Bard.
All these bags started popping up all over the lake. And we're talking 50-pound bags a pot. They fish hooked them or swam to them and got them and strapped them to their backpacks, or some of them couldn't carry a full 50-pound bag because it was water-soaked and it weighed probably 200 pounds. A couple of the guys were big, but most people had to break it up and strap it and carry it out. And that's how the conveyor went. And then obviously it was soaked in jet fuel and water. So we needed a place to dry it. And there was this beautiful boulder up above Camp 4 that had a perfectly flat top. And we spread out a tarp, and that was my job. My job was to dry it. And the sun came up and it dries it, and it was a perfect spot. And so we dried it all out and we bagged it, and then it went to either LA or the Bay Area.
Like, what were the mechanics for selling the weed at that point? Like, how did everybody move all the product, so to speak? Like, what happened? Especially because it's bales of marijuana. It's funny because in all the interviews we've done with this, everyone's like, there were 3 tons of marijuana on the plane and there were like bales. And I'm like, this is something that's normally sold by the ounce, and mentally I'm like, how many ounces are in a pound and how many pounds are in a ton? And you're like, that is so much marijuana. Like, how did you guys actually sell it all?
First, there was nobody in a group was any kind of like drug dealer, not even, right?
Climber John Long.
But we knew drug dealers. So that's how it was peddled. You try to make a deal with somebody who we knew was in the business of selling stuff, and you give them a bunch of stuff, and whatever they gave you back, that was what you made. I mean, it wasn't really.
So there wasn't a lot of haggling or negotiating or like hard business. It was just like, here's my bale of combustible marijuana. Just give me what you can.
Yeah, and it was a felony back then, right? So you want, at least for. I did just a few of those little deals, and I was, crapping my pants the whole time. Just like, I got to finish college. I got a bunch of stuff I want to do. I can't go to freaking jail for weed. And, you go to jail for doing this. So, just like, here, take this. And then you just run the other way.
So basically all we had to do is get it to those locations, and it was distributed. And then the money was distributed accordingly. And I'll just say a lot of us made a fair amount of money. I didn't make as much as some. Some made hundreds of thousands. Okay. I only made about maybe 40, but because I was just the dryer. I mean, people drove up in a XJ12 Jaguar.
That's awesome to think of Jim pulling up in a Jaguar.
Yeah, it was cool. It was a really bitchin' car. The Rangers couldn't figure it out. Yeah, because all of a sudden, Camp 4 had these, what they thought were climbing bum drug addicts, which we all were drug addicts, but they had a lot of things that they couldn't afford. And it was funny when they were scratching their heads going, what the fuck is going on?
We'll be back with more after the break.
How was the weed?
It was good. It definitely got its own name. When you rolled a joint, it would spark a little bit. Yeah, even after it was dried, it'd kind of go. When you put the match to it, it got nicknamed airplane weed. But no, it's good weed, really high quality.
It had this harsh taste to it, and people used to call it the airplane hack or something, a cough that you'd get from it because it was bad. but it made the rounds of Yosemite. Everybody, hey, you got some airplane? I got some good airplane here. That's what people would say.
I mean, smoking aviation fuel seems like it's just, isn't that all bad? That sounds terrible for you.
Yeah, that's probably why most of it was sold down in LA.
The doctor at the medical clinic started noticing a strange set of symptoms appearing in his patients.
And although he would not give me names, he would tell me, he would say, Butch, when these guys come in with this particular cough, this very distinctive kind of a cough that he could identify, he said there was no doubt in my mind as to what they've been smoking.
So we heard from Butch that the doctor in Yosemite was treating a lot of people with a very consistent condition, like a persistent cough that basically came from smoking that weed because of the aviation fluid and the fuel in the weed. But you said that you smoked a fair amount of it as well. Like, did it combust? Like, did it hurt your lungs? Did it make you cough? Like,
you put it in a pipe. First you let it dry out because it was sodden, right? And that would take a while, take a week or so because, it's got oil, basically oil in it. Like avgas has got a lot of petroleum mixed in with it. It would take a long time for the stuff to dry out. Then you stick it in a pipe, and as soon as you would hit it with a lighter, like a flame, like a blowtorch would leap off the stuff. It was like, what the hell's in that stuff, right? And we would use a bong, which would filter it through a bunch of water. So it wasn't nearly as, I don't think it was nearly as toxic. But yeah, I smoked a bunch of it and never had any problems.
Dale Bard, John Long, the late Jim Bridwell, and the gone too soon John Backer. There are other climbers too, whose names we have removed from these interviews. They were some of the greatest athletes of an era. Inside the culture of climbing, this set of people, they were like the 1980s Lakers, with their all-time greats and showmanship and style. They were so Californian. The money, and certainly the aura of making the money, made these stone masters even cooler in a way. They would later appear in TV shows and commercials. This little bit of money gave the lifestyle a little bit of flash.
So Backer was one of the people that went up there, and John did not have a car at that point. He was living in a tent in Camp 4. Like everybody else, but he didn't have wheels. So that's how Backer got his red van. He was able to buy his Volkswagen van, which upgraded his Camp 4 lifestyle tremendously. Yaba was like the pure dirtbag. He had no money. He had a tent patched with duct tape, and that was about all he had.
Rick is talking about John Yablonsky, known for his cutting-edge but very sketchy free solos and general all-around commitment to the lifestyle. We'll talk more about Yaba in Chapter 3.
And he lived in Camp 4 by scarfing. When people were done with their breakfast in the cafeteria, Yaba would go over there and grab their plates and finish it off. And he was one of the most blatant scarfers of anybody there. I remember tourists wouldn't finish their meal, but there'd be stuff they didn't touch. But Yaba, there would be a piece of toast with a bite out of it. He'd just bite right into it. He would, and to him, to get several $1,000s, whatever it was tremendous. He bought me dinner at the Mountain Room Grill there with big dinner. Well, that's there. Yabo, who was the poorest climber in Camp 4, was now well off and flaunting his newfound riches.
At this point, the climbers are raking it in, right? Like there's new cars in the Camp 4 parking lot and people are buying houses and they're eating super well. Like some of them are funding these international climbing trips and like going on expeditions all over the world. And, for some, it was like the weed money was just bonus cash. Like they got to fuel their adventures with this little bit of money that they made. But for some of them, it like really changed their lives forever.
It's hard to stay quiet about that sort of thing. People notice when you show up in a Jaguar. While we had a tough time sorting out the exact timeline when the weed began leaving the high country on the backs of climbers, it started out with just a few people and eventually grew. Winter gave way to spring. Before the Park Service shut down their recovery efforts, they'd remove an estimated 2,000 of the 6,000 pounds of weed on the plain. By the first week in April, climbers had removed at least another 2,000. Now the word was out. There was a new California gold rush. And with it, a new set of dangers. Next time on Climbing Gold.
That was a game. We didn't even think about anything like a risk or anything. We had way bigger fires to burn than that.
We're government employees, but we could kind of figure these things out that, maybe we should go back and check on this.
There's all kinds of people with guns and knives. Burton had the chainsaw a couple inches to some guy's throat the day before trying to steal our stuff, so.
Couldn't hear the helicopter coming from very far away. Everybody on that lake just scattered like a covey of quail. They just fled everywhere.
In the box was a kilo of cocaine and this book.
And he thought, I can capitalize on this. I can make some money out of this.
And that's when there was a sobering evening where we all thought, what the fuck is going on?
Climbing Gold is a production of Duct Taped and Beer. Alex Honnold is our host. Today's episode was written and edited by Lauren Delaney Miller and me, Fitzcahall. Additional production, editing, mixing, and original score by Evan Phillips. Additional music from Joey Canner and Brendan O'Connell. Tracks are courtesy of Track Club. Stoneman Meadow Audio is courtesy of David Vassar at Backcountry Pictures. Social media support from Jake Wheeler. Our executive producers are Ben Endy and Jonathan Redzik for RXR Sports, and Becca Cahal and Lacey Hendricks for Duct Taped and Beer. You've been listening to Climbing Gold.